Hello, everybody. We are about to start, but before we go into this session and talk about the working group, I want to sort of make a logistical remark, and that is earlier on during or just after the opening session, it was mentioned that the update of the FOC working groups was supposed to take place after this session, but the conference organizers decided that it wasn't really of that much use as all the open sessions have then already taken place. So we decided to cancel it. So this is as much as you'll get. So I'll then leave the floor to Ron.
Okay. Well, thank you, Simone. I'm Ron Diebert of Citizen Lab, and along with Simone, I'm co-chair of this working group. And I'll just introduce by saying that my own personal interest in this topic goes back many years. I've had for a long time a view that there was a disconnect between discussions around cybersecurity and the communities that are typically involved in those discussions and civil society. Certainly this was borne out in my own work, which I think kind of crosses the divide between the communities. So we were in a bit of a unique position. Especially after we published in 2009 a major cyber espionage report called the GhostNet report that, although coming at the topic from mostly the perspective of human rights problems and concerns, was very well received by people in the defense, law enforcement, and intelligence community. And getting to talk to some of those people, I realized that there were really separate conversations going on, separate languages. And I began to realize that this was going to be a problem from the perspective of human rights. And meanwhile, on the civil society side, I saw a similar issue, that there were groups and organizations that didn't want to engage on cybersecurity because they felt, well, that's what the men and women in uniforms do, and it's not something that we really have the expertise to engage in. And so I wrote an article, I think it was around 2010 or 11, saying that civil society needs a strategy for cybersecurity. And so a few years later, Simone met with me and explained to me that there was a possibility of a working group starting on this topic to discuss cybersecurity from a human rights perspective and with multi-stakeholder participation, and would I co-chair with her, and so I said yes. And so that leads us to where we are now, which is the working group that's been going on for a little over a year. Yeah, and I'm going to turn it over now to Simone, who's going to describe the constitution of the working group and some of the general parameters. Simone.
Yes, so before going into that, I think it's maybe good to sort of clarify the goals of the meeting today. And that is to introduce you to the working group and the work that we've been doing over the last year, to get feedback from you on that work, and also to discuss what you think we should be doing going forward. No, and let me say another thing, if for people coming in, but everything is, pretty much everybody is sitting first row, but because it's such an informal room, I would invite everybody to come as close as possible to sort of make this as sort of comfortable and sociable as possible. Yeah, so we're celebrating, or almost celebrating our first anniversary, as Ron already said. And we've done fantastic work with a fantastic group of people. And so before even really going into what we've done, I want to thank everybody that's been in this effort together. So Ron, all the members of the working group, and the Canadians and the US that have been contributing to this working group. I think in especially the last 6 months, we've done an impressive amount of work. And I'm a very proud co-chair. I'm very happy with all the work that people put in. And as she's now walking in, I can also thank Leah, who has done a relentless amount of work in supporting the working group. So what is it that we've been doing? We met last year during the IGF for the first time, and we discussed sort of what the mandate should be, what the focus should be, and I think pretty soon there was an agreement on two major issues. That there was a need to bring a human rights framing to the cybersecurity debate, and also that there is a need to increase civil society in cybersecurity debates. So that were sort of the main parameters of our work, combined with a general sense that whatever we were supposed to produce should be practical, so people should be able, based on that information, to either write better policy or be able to better participate in debates. That turned out into 4 different activities that we will elaborate on. The members of the working group, maybe it's a good idea if the members that are here would raise their fingers so that everybody can see who those are. Thank you. So we have different members of the working group explaining these different strands, but we've done 4 things. We've developed a definition on cybersecurity that is not so different maybe from the common definition, but which has a very strong human security element, which Eileen will elaborate on. We developed a map for all the spaces where cybersecurity is discussed. We've developed a normative framework for actually bringing a human rights framing into cybersecurity discussions. And we've developed, or we've launched a blog series that elaborates on some of these, or sort of gives an insight in some of these spaces. We will use this structure. This order will be slightly different for practical reasons because we expect most questions on the normative output. So the order that we will take is that we'll first discuss the mapping, then the blog, then the definition, and then the normative framework. So for that, I would like to invite Vlada to do the first bit.
Thank you, Simone. I didn't expect I would be the first one, but thanks. We are strategically diverse around the room. So my name is Vladimir Radunovic. I am not a member of the group directly, but I was invited to help to facilitate this work on mapping. And the whole idea, as Simone said, was basically, okay, we want to bring people that are dealing traditionally with human rights because of their interests, and particularly civil society, but we later on understood not only civil society, into cybersecurity debates. Now, those of you that are not in the working group, if you would have to follow, if you would wish to follow cybersecurity and you don't have anything, you don't know what's happening in the cybersecurity area, how would you possibly, what would you do? Where would you find information? How do you get involved in cybersecurity discussions? So the initial idea was, okay, let's try to help people by mapping what are the main events and main processes when it comes to cybersecurity, and where actually civil society can impact cybersecurity debates with human rights perspectives, which turned out to be not that simple. There are a lot of events. I think we managed to map about 60 events in this year, more or less related to cybersecurity. We wanted also to do 2016, but actually you can't really know what's happening in 2016, unfortunately. So that's something that's giving us space to do more. Now, the result of that is the following. I suppose you all got this nice bag from the organizers with all the program and stuff. And in it, there is, if you have it with you, try to find it in the bag. I will need your help with that. In it, there is a kind of a origami-like transformable piece of paper with nice colors, which actually looks like A5, but when you open it, you get A4. And guess what? You can open it once again, and you get A3 format. Now, those of you that were not parts or members of the working group, I really need your assistance to see if we managed to do something. So take a look, and I give you a minute to see if you would actually figure out what this all is about. And I won't ask you if you figured out, because I think it would be a failure, but you would probably need 5 minutes or more, so I won't give you that much time. Let's start from the beginning, and I really want to try to showcase it. The visual is based on a similar approach that was done for internet governance. And the idea is that when you open it once, you basically get main processes related to cybersecurity. Now, those of you that are following cybersecurity or internet governance would probably say, hey, but this is one way to group the processes. And it's really one way to group it. We've been dealing oh, thanks, we have it on the screen. Those that were working in a working group know that we spent about 2 months trying to somehow cluster the main processes. And we decided for the following. UN processes and subsidiary bodies. That means all of the UN-related processes, including UN General Assembly, the governmental group of experts which are dealing mostly with international peace and security, the World Summit on Information Society process, the work of the International Telecommunication Union, the work of the Human Rights Council, which, even though it's not particularly focused on cybersecurity, has relevance to human rights and security as well, and so on and so forth. The second track is Internet Governance Forum. And we deliberately decided to take it as a separate kind of block of a process, because it's very particular. For those of you that follow the Internet Governance process of the UN, you know that the agenda is very broad and it can hardly be mixed with anything else. The third one is the track of governmental and intergovernmental processes, and we are seeing more and more initiatives by the governments, led by the governments, not necessarily closed for the governments anymore. We have seen the GCCS, the Global Conference on Cyberspace, a couple of weeks ago, which was driven by the Dutch, but open for the other stakeholders. The Freedom Online Conference that we are here as well. But we are also seeing some of the processes which are more or less closed to the members of the community. Then the fourth one is technical and standard setting bodies, ICANN, IANA, W3C, and all these nice acronyms and abbreviations that no one understands, dealing with technical aspects. And lastly, and probably the unhappy title which we need to change in the next rounds, is other processes. They're equally relevant as those, but it's such a mishmash of processes from civil society, corporate sector, technical community, academia, that we simply couldn't find a better name for the moment, so we said other processes. And then you open up the A3 and you get the big picture, which is over there as well. And in these main 5 tracks, we tried, and I hope I gave you enough time to get the picture where you are and what you're looking at. We tried to map the main events that are taking place in each of these kind of clusters. We also tried to map the thematic coverage, and you have it in the legend on the bottom, cybercrime, network and infrastructure, international peace and security, digital rights, and those that are covering more than 2 topics. Then the level of inclusiveness, we thought it's particularly interesting for people that want to be involved in cybersecurity debates. Can you actually participate in an event? Is it open to everyone, green light? Is it closed to members only, red light? Or is it somewhere in between where actually you have to apply, but you might not be selected or approved, which is a yellow light? It should be simple to show you where you can participate, and also those that you can't, but you actually want to participate, and press more to be more open. And then lastly, the functional mechanism, which is whether the event just discusses something, like the Internet Governance Forum, or brings decisions as part of the process or at the event. Decision even in form of a chair statement or any kind of a formal document. And to try to close, let me just give you an example of the Freedom Online Conference. You can find it in the governmental, intergovernmental processes because it is driven by the governments. But when you find it in the month of May, you can see that the focus is on digital rights as a topic, that it basically brings decisions in the sense there is a set of recommendations coming out of the whole process, and it's open. It's a green light, it's totally open. And you can also see that it's linked to the GCCS, and the GCCS is linked to the one conference and so on. So we also try to map the links between some of the events. I will stop here, and just to conclude, for the next steps, if there will be next steps, this is far from ideal. This is the first step of trying to visually simplify the processes related to cybersecurity. And we hope in the next iterations, and we invite you for comments and suggestions how we can improve. We are also considering opening up the database so it can actually be a continuous process of updating the events, the tracks, the processes, the main topics, the level of openness, and many other attributes that we can think of. And I hope we'll be able to open it up and kind of crowdsource people to update that in future. I stop here, and I hope you're not too confused with the output. And back to you, Simone.
Thank you, Vlada, also for all your work on this. So yeah, it's in the end, it's of course quite simple. If you know where to go, if you know what to do, then the effect of what you might be able to, or what you might want to do, is will be bigger. But perhaps maybe some of you are already noticing that now, while you're looking at this calendar, not all of these spaces where cybersecurity discussions are taking place are known to people. People are often not familiar with the ITU or the One conference or the London process. So we thought that a second important activity would be to sort of, parallel to this track, launch a blog series where members of the working group or other guest bloggers would introduce these spaces, tell a little bit about their history, their relevance, especially their relevance to human rights, and then explain why you should keep an eye on these spaces for the next year or so, what will happen, and how you could engage as a particular civil society participant. We've launched this blog, I think it was December, when Ron published the first introductory blog. Since then we had one on the UN, one on the London process, one on the IETF. There will be one today which will be published, which is actually on our own working group, as we've been doing quite some work ourselves, and we thought that would be clarifying as well. And other upcoming blogs will be on the OSCE, confidence building measures, the WSIS, the ITU, special rapporteur on the freedom of expression, I forget that one, that will be published very shortly, and on the IGF. So with that, I'll hand it over to Eileen. Oh, I'm sorry.
Invite if anyone had comments.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good point. Let's see if anyone has comments or questions at this stage. Yes.
John Fox from the United Kingdom government. I forgot which government I represent then. Jet lag. I make this comment only because I'm in the human rights half of our ministry, and I've asked the cyber governance people in that side of our ministry about 10 times to explain the processes to me, so this is great. I really think it captures really well the different streams, and I like the way that you've linked them. My comment was obviously going to be that there's a lot of boxes on here, and they're obviously not all equally important, and this is where it becomes obviously subjective, and also there's a bit of inherent tension in there. And so I did wonder if in the next iteration, in the thing that you described about blogs, but somewhere it'd be worth just succinctly capturing where each of the main processes have particular responsibility for making key decisions. And again, particularly if I think about ITU versus IGF, there's different opinions amongst different stakeholders as to who should be taking the lead. But given that this is a Freedom Online coalition, we may be able to reach some sort of common ground, at least amongst ourselves, as to where we feel at least the key decision-making forum are. Because otherwise it's, if I was an outside, I mean, even if if I didn't need myself to turn up to this, I would still need to go to my cyber people and say, okay, but which ones are where the key decisions are being made? And there's all, and so on.
I can respond to that, but that's more from a personal perspective, and I would like, maybe the other way around. Vlada, could you tell what your considerations there have been?
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion on that as well in the group, and we had a lot of dilemmas on how to avoid subjective views when it comes to clustering the processes, when it comes to what are the main attributes that we want to see. And there was the idea to mark also the events that have capacity building potential and the events that have e-participation, but it would overcrowd the thing. And you're totally right. We did actually mark a couple of events, and if you take a closer look at the map, you'll see a bit of a shadow behind some of the events. But that's also, and it's very, very light. That's also, we didn't want to push it stronger, exactly for the reason you said. It's kind of a subjective view that these might be possibly the most important events. But that's something that really the group needs to work on and include more of the inputs from the community. And at this point, I really have to thank the whole group. I was just facilitating that, but the group was really, really active. I mean, this is something that can't be done by a single person. And I hope in the next steps, whatever way we go, we'll have more and more people to actually comment on that, link that to blogs and relevance, because those are the tricky things. But very good point, yeah.
Sarah?
Just one idea that your comment made me think of. It might be interesting as part of like the launch process for this mapping to develop some kind of like civil society online training, like where it's a Google Hangout, maybe over the course of 1 or 2 sessions, where you actually present the different spaces and talk about them, maybe send a preliminary survey to people who are interested in participating to see what their main focuses are, what they're aware of already, what they want to learn more about, and actually have like an interactive discussion to sort of teach and raise capacity about how you can engage with these mechanisms and what the most interesting ones are.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable suggestion. We tried to do something similar for the GCCS. We organized a pre-event, or at least Global Partners organized the pre-event. The Dutch supported it, because we considered sort of the civil society participation in the global conference with the question, would it be sufficient to invite civil society to participate in these discussions when they are very specific, and often it's not that easy to sort of, it's not that transparent how to participate and how you can be most effective. And so we've tried to set up something similar, but it definitely needs further development, so we'll take this into consideration. Thank you. And what I also want to add to the previous comments is that I think apart from the meetings that are now most important, and often their relevance is in flux, it also depends on, like what the government, for example, hosting the event in London process will do with such an event. I think it's maybe even more important to highlight where the potential is in future, and I think that, and maybe stressing that some of the spaces that we may be not considering as relevant are super relevant, but their work is not just not so known. So I think there is lots of nuances where it just emphasizes that we need to share much more knowledge on these spaces, and for anybody interested with special knowledge on any of these spaces and willing to write a blog for our blog series, please contact me. Anybody wanting to comment or pose a question at this point? Vlada.
Just a brief reflection. That's a very good idea. That I remember that we might actually, as one of the follow-ups, can possibly map the existing capacity building programs, initiatives that already cover this. So in a lot of instances, we don't need to organize something new. That's something that's been done under the IGF when it comes to internet governance, trying to map what is there when it comes to capacity building. And we might actually try to do something like that in this field as well, to help people, if they wish to learn more about cybersecurity, to already grab some of the opportunities that there are.
All right, thank you. Eileen.
So as Simone said, the primary purpose of this working group is two-part. One we just heard about, which is helping civil society become more engaged in cybersecurity conversations and processes, as Vlada just mapped out. Second part is to integrate human rights thinking and framework into cybersecurity policy making. And so to do that, one of the first tasks of this working group was to generate a definition of cybersecurity. And one of the things we learned is that generating a definition sounds like a very basic task, but it may turn out to do more normative work for us than we realized at first blush. So as an initial matter, we started with this fundamental awareness that the term cybersecurity has come to signify many different things to many different people, depending on context. So there's many examples. Cybersecurity in some communities refers primarily to national security concerns and counterterrorism issues. In other communities, it's about international peace and security and the concern about a threat of cyber warfare. And in either of those two examples, the object of cybersecurity is often seen primarily as a matter of protection of critical infrastructure, or information, communication, internet infrastructure. In other communities, cybersecurity can signify something to do with consumer protection, or in some cases, private sector economic competitiveness, where the focus is often on data protection or protection of proprietary or confidential information. So our goal was to generate a working definition that would be comprehensible for all of these communities, but also, very importantly, reinforce a human rights framework for everyone in all cybersecurity conversations, and to remind policymakers in each of these silos that cybersecurity must also be a matter of digital security for individuals. And so in this regard, one of the starting places in our definition was to, we recognized we wanted to reinforce existing obligations under international human rights law, where universal rights are understood to inhere in individuals. That's a foundational concept. And we also wanted to reinforce the obligations under existing international humanitarian law, where concern for civilians is paramount. So and those were two concepts we wanted to start with. Second, in keeping with the overarching theme of this working group, Internet Free and Secure, rather than playing into the existing or the dominant binary framing of, freedom versus security, privacy versus security, human rights versus security, we wanted to help establish an understanding that human rights protection entails both optimization of freedom and security, and that within a human rights frame, both of those things matter. Neither side of that equation can be disregarded. And oh, by the way, the same thing is true in cybersecurity, that in fact, security and freedom are deeply interrelated and synergistic rather than zero-sum. And we don't mean that as sort of some Pollyanna thing. It's a very practical idea that you can't really exercise freedom if you don't have basic security. And oh, by the way, you can't really generate national security or international peace and security if people don't have freedom to exercise. So yes, it's an ideal, but it's a very pragmatic concept as well. Third, we began with a commitment to technological innovation, which we saw as essential for the continued free flow of information globally, which has to do with freedom of expression and basic civil political rights, and also concern for the open, interoperable internet as a platform for communication, as well as for the protection of freedom and security. So technological innovation we didn't want to throw under the bus. And last, we wanted our definition to be technically informed, because we were aware, and maybe Tim will say something about this, that many communities have already done a lot of definitional work on different dimensions of cybersecurity, and we didn't want to reinvent the wheel or create unnecessary confusion or tension with other communities. So we intentionally turned to several terms previously defined by the International Organization of Standardization, ISO, for use in our definition, notably the concepts of availability, confidentiality, and integrity. And so, as you see, that's what we ended up with. The elements I just described are there in either the preamble or the definition itself. And I don't know, Tim, do you want to say anything about the specific terms?
So just a couple of comments. On the part on the preamble is essentially a restatement of the UN Human Rights Council resolution on human rights applying online as well as offline. The international humanitarian law is a reference to the GGE report from 2013, and thereby the working group directly reinforcing those two statements by the international community. And then for the definition part, as Eileen said, the ISO definition, that's the core of the definition, which is, by the way, also, for example, the definition that I believe the new DoD strategy uses. But the key piece here being the last part of the focus on the persons, both offline as well as online, which is what makes this definition different from the existing ones. And yeah, so just, and the last comment, if you could put up the website for a second. What we used for developing this definition was a project that we did at New America in the context of the OACE, actually, where the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has a CBM focused on definitions, CBM 9, and we published a report that was commissioned by the Swiss government. So if any of you love definitions and terms, this website has a search function which you can type in cybersecurity and it gives you the existing definitions, so you can compare the working group definition with other existing definitions that are currently out there, and hope that you will use it.
All right, both of you, thank you very much. Matthew, do you want to take further?
Sure. Hi, I'm Matthew Shears with the Center for Democracy and Technology, a member of the working group and also the facilitator for the normative part of this work. So the last part, if you will, of this four-part work that the working group has been doing has really been about looking about advancing human rights within the cybersecurity framing in a normative sense. And to do that, and to give you a sense as to the work we've been doing, I've got 4 slides I'll run through at a very high level, and then open for questions, and hope that my very able and expert working group members will jump in. So I hope, yes, I see you can see it. So if we look at really what the purpose of this was, which was to really, at the end, the working group decided that there was a space for us to make a difference in a normative space, and that was to look at how do we develop a set of recommendations that really do promote greater stakeholder-driven and human rights respecting approaches to cybersecurity. And this was really the kind of the framing that we wanted. As Eileen has mentioned, this really was about implementing and looking at how we shape the policies behind cybersecurity and the cybersecurity practices. So the purpose of these recommendations is really to provide guidance, mostly to policy stakeholders, but to all stakeholders involved in cybersecurity matters, whether it be at the policy-making level or shaping level, or whether it would be in other kinds of practices. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to ensure that stakeholders actually do look at cybersecurity. And when they look at cybersecurity policy-making, they really look at it in terms of making sure that it is rights-respecting by design. And that's really the intent of this piece of work. Could I have the... Thank you. So, so the approach. So we basically went back and we said, okay, so we've heard about that cybersecurity must be rights respecting, it must involve all stakeholders, and I'll come to all the different kinds of statements that have been made to that effect. But what we realized was there was a lot of talk, but not a huge amount of action. How do we get from talking about it to actually having an impact and integrating these two very important key notions in cybersecurity policymaking? So we looked at, leveraged, and built on existing language and commitments, and I'll come back to examples of that. And then the second part was obviously drafting a set of recommendations that builds on those commitments that have been made. So there's nothing hugely startling about this, but the recommendations as a whole actually fill a gap in the policymaking space that's quite unique in this sense. And then the third part, which we're coming to that point of the third part now, which is really about consulting with stakeholders and then going out and seeking endorsement from stakeholders. So how have we worked? We've had numerous online exchanges and calls. We've been working on numerous drafts and web-based tools. We've had 3 in-person meetings at the IGF in Istanbul, at the Circumvention Tech Festival in Valencia, and most recently at the GCCS in The Hague. Both the IGF and the Hague meeting, most of the members were present. It was a slightly lesser number in Valencia. So our working approach and methods really have been based upon taking the definition that Eileen just described as kind of a foundational point, and also looking at, as I said, what's been said before on these particular issues. We're working on the basis of consensus. This is an important issue. We have had some very interesting and robust discussions about certain issues in the group, because obviously we have the full range of stakeholders in the group. But that being said, it has been exceptionally collaborative and iterative, and I'll come to where we are in the process in the last slide. Could I have this next slide, please? So our work really has you can break it down into the three parts. The first, which is really looking at what's been said, how do we leverage that, drafting the recommendations themselves, and then looking at procedural recommendations of how we can actually put these recommendations into practice. And as I said before, this isn't anything new in the sense that there have been many calls for more rights-respecting approaches to cybersecurity, more stakeholder engagement. I think it's worthwhile me just referring to two statements that were made most recently in the London process to give you a sense as to where the discussion has actually to what point the discussion has gotten and how we're leveraging that. So for example, in the chair's statement at the GCCS meeting in The Hague, the statement urged governments to ensure that cyber policy at national, regional and international levels is developed through multi-stakeholder approaches, including civil society, the technical community, businesses and governments. And I'll just note that it says to ensure that cyber policy. So that's a key evolution in the way people have been referring to stakeholder engagement in cybersecurity issues. And at the same conference, in the same statement, the chair urged stakeholders to, quote, ensure that cybersecurity policies are, from their inception, rights respecting and consistent with international law and international human rights instruments. So there are many, many other quotes and statements that have been made in the past, including in various Human Rights Council statements, also at the UNGA and elsewhere. And this work, I should say, also builds on and leverages the work that was pulled together by the multi-stakeholder working group for the talent recommendations. So much of this work has existing bases and existing foundations. So then we got about to drafting the actual recommendations, and I've just described this as draft recommendations that establish the what, in a way. What does it mean for cybersecurity to be rights respecting by design? And then we have a whole set of recommendations that we're in the middle of working our way through and having a final iterations, but this one that's up here is an example of the kind of recommendation that we have been working on. And I might actually just read a couple of other ones as well. So you see here we got that stakeholders should recognize that promoting and enhancing human rights is a key element in ensuring digital security and privacy online. That's one example of a recommendation we have. Another one, for example, is the protection and promotion of human rights should be at the core of cybersecurity and related national policies, and the development of such policies should be rights respecting by design. So you can get an idea of the kind of recommendations that we're working on. And just a third one in the same sense, which is preventative measures and responses to cyber attacks and cyber crime should not undermine human rights, democratic values, or the rule of law. So those are the draft recommendations that establish the what. And then we got around to the draft procedural recommendations, if you will, that establish the how. And this was really about what are the approaches, what are the mechanisms that need to be used to ensure that cybersecurity is rights respecting by design. And you can see one example, which is to promote, through multi-stakeholder approaches to cybersecurity, policy development at national, regional, and international levels. So again, focusing on the stakeholder engagement, focusing on all stakeholders having a role in policy. And I'll just quote another one in the same group. Another one is, cybersecurity policies should, from their inception, be rights respecting and consistent with international law, international human rights instruments, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So these are very much the how of the set in this set of recommendations. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, we got it. All right. So where are we? We're very close to being able to circulate a copy of this work for greater input. We still have a couple of recommendations that we're working our way through. We certainly do expect for this to go out for further inputs from the Freedom Online community, and then obviously to a broader community as well. And we're looking at finalizing these recommendations by the IGF in November in Brazil. As you can see, we've submitted a proposal for a workshop so we can discuss these recommendations with a broader audience. What's next? These recommendations are not targeted at, I should have said this up front actually, but these recommendations are not targeted specifically at the Freedom Online Coalition member governments. These recommendations are targeted at all stakeholders. They do not, in and of themselves, require any kind of formal endorsement by the Freedom Online Coalition members. So when it says here dissemination and endorsement by stakeholders, it very much means that we are looking for endorsement by stakeholders beyond just governments. Now, obviously we have a special relationship with the Freedom Online government, so we are obviously going to be looking for endorsement from some, hopefully more than just some, governments within the Freedom Online Coalition, but that's something that we have to work through as we take this process forward. And the goal at the end of the day is to see these recommendations incorporated into existing policy development, cybersecurity practices and processes, so that they really do provide the kind of rights-respecting approach that we would all want to see taken by governments and other stakeholders when they're developing cybersecurity policies and frameworks. Possible next steps. In many ways, one could look at this as just the beginning. These recommendations could be further elaborated. They could be moved from recommendations into principles. That would take further work. We could be looking at how do we practically implement these recommendations? What are the practical steps that need to be taken? And we've been discussing a number of other ideas about what we could be taking, how we could be taking this work forward. What are the next steps? So let me stop there. And just a big thanks to the working group members who have really gone through a lot of work and some heartache to get this to the point where it is today. Thanks.
Questions or comments? Nobody. Okay. So, okay, Sarah.
Yeah, my question is about the definition. I think it's a really useful conceptualization of the issue of cybersecurity, and in many ways, perhaps a better approach to online freedom than the framing of online freedom as it currently stands, given the politicization of that issue. I was wondering what the goals or the plans are for propagating that definition or otherwise trying to advance that definition.
So what we for the GCCS, we had the webinar series. I was the co-chair for the training program that was set up, and the start of each webinar started with reciting this definition to share it with other civil society organizations. And I think that's only a start. Ideally, this in documents that are going to be produced on human rights and cybersecurity, I think ideally this would become kind of the starting point, and once that happens, but that depends on the buy-in and whether it's actually adopted by people who are represented in this room. So I think it kind of depends on the people who are here to spread the word and share the word that this exists, and if people agree with it, using it so that it becomes self-replicating. At the same time, I think there's also an opportunity for the processes where you have actual like resolutions or statements where this becomes adopted to then make it into more formal processes.
Just to add to that, in that exact same vein, but even bringing it up to a bigger level, our whole enterprise here, as well as this definition, is kind of, we're seeking a paradigm shift. And as I said at the top, it turns out just the basic definition, if it's credible and if it doesn't create a lot of controversy, and we can have people start, using it publicly, ends up changing the mentality of different players, and it will infiltrate the thinking in different silos as they currently exist. But at the end of the day, this whole idea of rights respecting by design, which is at the heart of the vision of this working group, you have to believe that that's actually advantageous for security. That, you know, it's not because you just care about the right side, it's actually you believe deeply that it's interrelated with enhancing security in the big sense and the long-term sense. And so it really, we are trying to have a paradigm shift that we think is warranted and beneficial regardless of whether your job is international peace and security, or your job is national security, or your job is counterterrorism, or your job is digital security for individual users, or whatever your job is. It's actually helpful for your domain of security. And so that's what we're hoping to do.
Yeah, maybe to comment on that, I thought it was at least interesting to see that most of the governments this morning in their opening statements reference to that security should never be a reason to limit freedoms. But I think we're not always thinking about the way what that should look like in sort of policy writing or in practical steps. And so I think it would be great if the different countries, at least from the Freedom Online Coalition, could take this work up and try to implement it in their policies. And of course, sort of relating to this last point, or the question, how this work can push forward, I think the effect of all the activities that we've been doing with the working group very much depends on the use of this work for you, whether it's a definition, the mapping exercise, or the normative output. So in that sense, I would like to put the question actually to you, also for us and for going forward. Do you think that what we've produced so far is useful, is something that helps you in your work, whether you're part of civil society, government, or business? Anybody? Thanks.
So from a civil society perspective, I think it's extremely valuable. But I'm curious, when you talk about a paradigm shift, that's big. And I'm wondering from the working group's interactions, if you have a sense of the breadth of commitment across governments, not the number of governments, but the breadth within governments to that. We heard a lot of it this morning. We certainly heard a tremendous amount of it in The Hague. But there are other elements of governments that have very powerful influence on decision-making. And I'm not sure I see the paradigm shift in that realm. Wondering what, and not to put responsibility on you, but just what your thoughts are in how you build that culture of a paradigm shift. For example, for civil society, from the experiences, I see tremendous interest. I see a lot of awareness. I see a tremendous thirst for learning more. But I also see a lot of lack of expertise and, more importantly, credibility from the national security, within the national security community and the military community to even listen. And so it seems to me it's a huge endeavor. And I'm just curious, as you went through this, if you have other thoughts or ideas of what those responsibilities of other stakeholders or what the accountability of stakeholders might be that could really make this happen.
So taking my facilitator hat off, I think, Jean, you actually raise a very good question, which is, in a way, this is a rather fascinating test, right? I think one of the advantages for us as a whole community is that by focusing on stakeholder engagement and rights, there is a kind of an indivisible aspect to those two parts, and people are, governments and other stakeholders are recognizing that at the moment. So the more that we can open up policy-making processes in the cybersecurity space, the more I think that the rights-respecting element will be inserted into those discussions. At least that's my hope.
So I have a slightly different answer, which is, to your question, I think that it's a mixed bag in terms of what exists within governments. And in fact, I think a lot of the framing we heard even today among the governments here who are the so-called champions of freedom online still have a tendency to frame it as it's still a little bit binary where, you know, we should never be violating rights in the name of security, but not really seeing protection of freedom as an aspect of security. So, you know, I was hearing a lot of that today. But so that's sort of the bad news. That you're absolutely right, Jean. We're nowhere near there. We're not yet on the cusp. But in some other circles, you know, a lot of the circles that are on the cutting edge of the technology as it relates to defense, I've seen some changes. Like, you know, like DARPA has a big project right now which is going straight at this question of how to get the upside of big data without undermining privacy. I think it's called the Brandeis Project or whatever. And a lot of cryptographers, I know this, in fact, today at Stanford, there's a talk, from a cryptography talk, about on this exact topic of how do you do both? How do you get the benefits for purposes of counterterrorism, of you know, getting information without undermining the not only privacy, security of users. And I think the fact that undermining privacy is now being, people are getting it, that it's undermining security and that it flows all the way down. It ends up undermining the security of the network. It undermines the security of people in government when they want to have private conversations. I mean, it undermines everybody's security. So I think that some people are saying defense is the new offense kind of thing. And I think some players are catching on. I don't think it's yet infiltrated into what is said by all parts of government everywhere, even in today's session. But it's starting to happen, and I think the technologists are with us.
Yeah, Sasha had a question, and I would just like to ask one of the other governments maybe that were participating in the working group to quickly sort of respond to Jean's comment on, you know, how we can at least sort of develop better policy in combining the different policy tracks within government, and then I'll give the floor to Sasha. Thanks.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Seth Bouvier. I'm at the U.S. State Department. I mean, if the question is how do we get to a paradigm shift, I guess I'm not sure I know the answer other than, you know, we try to take small incremental steps and, you know, hopefully at some point we get there, right? I think that's probably the best answer to that question. I can, you know, speak for the United States government, and you know, I can tell you that we do have a pretty strong commitment to these issues, and you know, can highlight a couple things. There's the NIST framework for protecting critical infrastructure, which you know I think is a great thing to point to. I wouldn't even say it was government-led; it was private sector-led, and you know, it's something that is out there as a resource that I think is pretty good. You know, we're launching a new multi-stakeholder cybersecurity initiative as well. If people are interested in that, you can come talk to me, and I'm happy to give details on that. And I think just taking a step back, one of the issues that sort of framed this working group is the acknowledgement that there's very, very few governments in the world where civil society and other stakeholders can come and have a conversation about cybersecurity issues. It's a very closed space. And, you know, so highlighting that fact, trying to present good examples where that kind of engagement has worked well and produced good outcomes and actually, you know, is worthwhile highlighting those issues and those places where that's happened, I think it will be really valuable. And the more we can open up that space for those conversations around the world, I think, like Eileen was saying, you know, I think maybe that's sort of the wedge where you get in and try to have the conversations about how to be more rights respecting by design. But yeah, I think it's baby steps.
Hi, I'm Sascha van Geffen from the Netherlands. I work at Greenhost, a hosting provider and intermediary in the Netherlands, and I am also one of the working group members of this working group. I just wanted to respond to the question about the paradigm shift and how that can come about, because I think that's a very important point that you brought up. So we've discussed this in the working group and also outside. I've been one of the strong pushers, I think, for a kind of like we should go in this direction. And I think, especially if you're from civil society, it makes a lot of sense to actually engage to the private sector as well on these issues, because if you look at that, there has been a tremendous push towards governments from the private sector to do more towards defense in terms of cybersecurity and shift the balance between offense and defense as a kind of like basis, especially of course after the Snowden revelations and the kind of business that big providers like Google and others lost over these kind of revelations. So there is already a kind of like structure going on where we're talking about the defense, and the defense is I think very strongly bound to this notion of cybersecurity that we put forward, the security of the end user as enabling security throughout the whole network. I mean, and this is very compelling to governments as well, right? I mean, it's the kind of narrative in which I can say, well, this time it was only a crappy movie that wasn't showed, that didn't open for office just before Christmas. It was a bit later because of some hacking. But next time it might be something that we actually hold more dear than that. So I think there are all these kind of examples and very compelling arguments to push for a broader definition of cybersecurity. Having said that, and having looked at the kind of like stakeholders within the Freedom Online Coalition as well, and especially the countries, I think we should definitely also look at the kind of newer countries to the table of the coalition and see, for instance, very smart things were said by, for instance, the representatives of Mongolia and Latvia about these kind of topics that are actually rhyming a lot more to that, and they are coming to this kind of notion, and they're coming from a kind of clean slate perspective, right, where some of the governments in the Freedom Online Coalition might have become a bit more tainted recently. So maybe I would hope for those new governments to be able, in a true, let's say, developing versus like long-standing actors within the Freedom Online Coalition, for those countries to stand out and help those people in need, like the US and the UK and the Netherlands, in developing better policies.
Sarah.
Yeah, just to follow on those points about paradigm shift, I think it is absolutely essential that the messenger be someone or something other than the United States, because unfortunately I think if the message comes from the United States, it automatically leads to backlash in terms of pickup amongst other states around the globe. Of course, it will require the U.S. support, but I think it needs to be voiced by entities such as Mongolia, as Sasha said, as well as others in the developing world, perhaps India, maybe other allies from the global south. I think it might also be interesting in terms of the paradigm shift to explore the links of this definition to development, because I think it's absolutely critical that when we talk about providing access to communities around the world, we talk not just about access in general, but about secure access and making it that way from the get-go, because we're seeing so much exploitation of developing countries in terms of their use of mobile devices and mobile apps that are basically being distributed in a willfully insecure manner. So I think if we're able to link this confidentiality, integrity, availability concept to development concepts, that might actually create more pickup and lead to a paradigm shift.
Thank you. Anyone else? Could I then maybe ask different working group members, or at least working group members from different stakeholder groups, to sort of highlight for them what is the potential of the work of the working group has so far been doing, and what would be the potential in taking the work forward? Somebody from civil society, I guess, somebody from the government, and somebody from companies. Who wants to take? I'm sorry, guys, for putting you on the spot, but you know, you had it coming. Who's going first?
just one company. I started as civil society during my time at the working group, and now work for industry. I'm Yochai Ben-Avi from Mozilla. I think that what was one of the most interesting parts of participating in the working group for me was coming to consensus around the definition of cybersecurity, and given the many diverse perspectives that we have here, it was really great that we could come to this. Yes, paradigm shifts are incremental and they take time. That's sort of the nature of the beast, but I think that this is a really important framing. I think that if we look at one of the topics that we explored in the blog post that Simone and I wrote together, is that if we look at the exploits, the data breaches, the hacks that are sort of dominating the public conversation when we think about cybersecurity, they don't really align with traditional government paradigms that tend to focus, particularly in the West, on critical infrastructure. And that this is sort of helps to provide that basis for thinking about a shift or an expansion in those paradigms to focusing on security of users and securing the online experience of users. And so I think that we've taken with the normative framework an opportunity to sort of start thinking through what does that look like on a more operational level and making a series of recommendations. And I hope that the governments at the FOC, but also more broadly, will consider those recommendations, that we can start to take them to a sort of more practical level. And again, that will be incremental, it will take time, but I think that we need to be having those conversations, and that this provides a basis and sort of foundation to ground those conversations, and a new way of thinking about these issues. I think that another really important aspect that was highlighted as part of our research and as part of the mapping project was noting how many of these fora where cybersecurity policy is being discussed have red and yellow lights, right, are closed to civil society in some capacity. And so I hope that we, in highlighting this, can all work both as the working group and with the FOC, but also more broadly, those of us in the community who are here can commit ourselves to thinking through new strategies and pathways to be more inclusive of civil society in particular in those cybersecurity policy-making fora.
Thank you, Yochai. Anyone else? Yeah, great.
So for civil society, I think it's kind of what Jean was saying. I think it's extremely useful for civil society. There is a lot of interest in the issues, but there's just a reticence to engage because of the, I think, perception more than anything of the technical knowledge that would be required to participate, and also it's just quite obtuse. You know, the mapping really helps with that for sure, even though you will see there are still some closed processes. And then I think, you know, we've, over the last, you know, couple of decades, we've gotten civil society at the table for a lot of internet governance engagement and sort of shifting the language of internet rights online. And I think now people are ready to use that capacity and also then move into cybersecurity policy spaces. So basically, I think what the normative statement really does for civil society is it takes the language that they're used to using in these sort of internet rights policy spaces and applies cybersecurity to it. So it's familiar and it can be used for not just sort of international norms, but then also national and more local efforts. I think, so one of the things that I was thinking about when I worked on this normative statement was what are some of the real issues related to internet rights that we know from our work in civil society for the last 25 years, people are worried, you know, they're interested and they're worried about. And one of the things that I brought up was, for example, gender-based violence online or tech-enabled gender-based violence. I think that's one example of, I think, more consultation we could do with civil society and actually coming up with more issues that are like that are not traditionally thought of as related to cybersecurity. Kind of Eileen was going through the different definitions of like, what does cybersecurity mean to different communities and different places. I mean, I think often it's not anyway, sort of cybersecurity conjures up a lot of images, but I think a really robust cybersecurity strategy or policies need to go beyond sort of the typical, visions of what cybersecurity means. So, gender-based violence being one, there are probably others, and that would be part of the sort of larger consultation process to make sure that we're including those issues.
I'll just be a good sport and I'll take the government part here. So I've been extremely lucky, I think, over last year to be able to work on this working group simultaneously with organizing, or at least help organize, the Global Conference on Cyberspace, which is part of the London process and is one of the biggest cybersecurity conferences there is. And one of the big goals for the Dutch government was to make that at least more inclusive for civil society. For me, it's very interesting to see how the work that we've been doing with the working group is relevant to the work that I've been doing for the conference. In a way, what we've been doing in the working group has directly fed into to the conference, into the chair statement, in what we've tried to put down. Just to give a quick overview, we've, for the first time, included in the agenda of the global conference the theme freedom and privacy. We've organized a pre-event for 40 civil society participants for cybersecurity capacity building to ensure that the different people participating would be better informed of the debate. We've issued a chair statement that is ambitious on both, I think, the topic of including human rights framing into the cybersecurity debate, as well as inviting all stakeholders and encouraging other governments to invite all stakeholders to that debate. And we've invited, in the end, about 600 civil society participants to this conference. And what I wish, first of all, that I would have had this at the beginning of the year to sort of, at least for myself, really understand how big the space was, what the relevant audience would be, and what the different places are where these issues are being discussed. Not only to understand the size of the issue, but also to better understand within my own government how many different tracks there are and how difficult it is to coordinate on these issues, what it requires. For the same reason, I wish we also would have had something like the normative output, where you can discuss something, you have something concrete to discuss what it is you want to implement in the policy, and then not only talk about sort of the abstract, more conceptual issues, but actually talk about how this would work in practice and what the different hurdles for different partners within governments are to accept principles like these. And that is what we'll use it for going forward. We have had the luck, and this sort of goes back to Jean's issue as well, that at least within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because the global conference was just such a big exercise, and we organized sort of a special task force for that. We now have one task force with a lot of knowledge, and we're trying to keep the task force on and give them a coordinated function, not only within the Dutch MFA, but for the whole Dutch government, which would make it more easy to tackle these issues and to incorporate the issues that we've been discussing here today. So I hope that all succeeds, and that will, in that sense, have some kind of best practice that we can also share with other governments and help to push this agenda forward.
Can I say a final word?
Yeah.
Are there other questions, by the way, or comments that people want to make before we? Okay, so I wouldn't mind saying a final remark because Jim.
Yeah, I'm something of an outsider to this, but I'm fascinated by this idea that being rights-respecting by design will enhance security. And the paradigm shift, which I think you were alluding to, would be a paradigm shift that, in fact, that is the case, but there will still be some cases. It's a presumption of common discourse and a presumption, certainly, of what a lot of governments say around the world, that there's a trade-off and that people have to grapple with a trade-off. Now, if you think that a really careful examination of specific policy domains will lead to the conclusion that being rights-respecting by design will, in fact, enhance security, then the outliers are not the cases where there's the outliers will be the cases where there's a trade-off, and the majority of cases will be the cases where your presumption holds. But it seems to me to really deliver on that, you need a more detailed and nuanced account of where the trade-off arises, where it doesn't, and what is the fully articulated argument that being rights respecting by design will enhance security, because there are a lot of different policy domains where this arises. I think a side issue, this would be great as a part of our agenda for the deliberations, but it has to be developed more, because otherwise it sounds like a wonderful slogan where you can have everything you want at the same time, but in fact I think it's a hard-nosed, based on a hard-nosed calculation, but it's got to be backed up. So that's what a real, from my standpoint, a real deliberation would spell that out. So I just wanted, we need to talk more about this.
That's a really good point. Actually, it picks up on what I wanted to say. I think I'm probably one of the more pessimistic people in the working group in terms of the prospects of actually advancing this agenda. I look at that definition, I think it's wonderful on paper, but it also strikes me as how far removed it is from the reality on the ground, even among the Freedom, especially among many of the Freedom Online Coalition member states. Just to give one example, in my own country right now, there is anti-terror legislation that will probably pass through because of majority government, and among the many, many contentious elements of that legislation is one component that would allow security agencies to go before a judge to ask to violate the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Canada. So that's how far we are in Canada from this nice definition on the wall. I think in terms of paradigm changes, the big paradigm change has actually been going on since about the mid-1990s in the other direction. And that's the challenge that we face. I think it started when cyberspace, the internet really, was defined in national security terms. And cyber was defined as a domain within which governments would fight and win wars. And it's become an object of geopolitical contestation, which has generated a huge industry around surveillance and computer network attack and exploitation. And I think that's very hard to turn around. But it's very important, if we are going to do that, to identify what are the piecemeal steps we can take. Two come to mind for me. One is trying to apply legal instruments where you can, and this is where I think the whole interesting debate about export controls and applying sanctions and export controls around spyware and dual-use technologies offers a potential opening here. And a second area would be engaging the core engineering community, the original stewards of the internet. If you go to the IETF, which I did in Vancouver, the first one after the first Snowden disclosures, there were proposals being put forth to how can we as engineers protect the internet from this sort of attack. And I think the more that we can think of analogies like Tim Mauer's and Duncan Hollis's idea of a Red Cross for cyberspace, and trying to think of giving back the architecture that was there at the beginning through the vehicle of certs, I think we might be able to slowly advance this agenda, but we're a long way from a paradigm change because the paradigm change is going in the opposite direction. I don't want to end on a negative note, though. I am stepping aside as co-chair of this working group, so I wanted to thank the other members of the working group for tolerating my absences because of workload, but I'd really like to thank Simone and Leah for shepherding the load, and it's been a real pleasure, so thank you for that.
All right, well, after these kind words, we're closing this session. Thank you all for your participation. If you're interested in the working group, there is a website on the FOC Coalition, the FO Coalition website with all the information about the working group, and there will also be a blog posted later today which sort of summarizes everything that we've told here today. Thank you, and see you at the reception.